On behalf of Drexel CS575 Group 7, I'm Carmine Valentino, and welcome to our presentation of our project, DragonBids. DragonBids is an auction application system which utilizes a client and server architecture in a distributed fashion. This allows for native Java applications at both client and server to communicate remotely using the Remote Method Invocation Protocol, or Java RMI. This protocol allows clients and servers to invoke methods on each other remotely using a common interface. At the conception of our project, we identified a number of user stories with which we wanted to implement and we thought would be part of an auction application. There exists really two types of users for DragonBids, a buyer and a seller user. Our user stories are reflective of either of these users. In a moment, I'm going to demo just a few of these user stories as they're implemented today. When designing our application, we decided against a typical database. Instead, we wrote this standalone server application which manages its own data structures, and we wrote a kind of a control layer for the middle, more so an accessor and mutator, so to speak, which is provided access through our custom API to and from the client. And this allows us to pretty much abstract all of the data that we have in our data stores from the user and also from the server in itself. Conceivably, this would be an easy way to transition to a database if this were to become a full-size, full-scale application. But for the reasons within the project constraints, this was a little bit quicker for us to prototype, and it actually has a few benefits. The server holding all of the data structures in memory is really fast if you compare it to reading it off of a disk or reading it over the network. So that was one benefit for our testing. The other was we got to destroy the instance of the server application and then therefore destroy our data tables and data structures at the same time. This allowed for easy mock-up and easy testing. Later on, we decided to persist some of that data solely for testing, but conceivably this could be done to create a local backup of your server and therefore your data structures. Alright, let's get started. So I'm going to fire up an instance of our server application, DragonBids server, and two instances of DragonBids client, our client application. So I'm going to put the server window here on the left-hand side and both clients stacked on top of the right. So as we can see, nothing's going on right here until we start the server, which creates the Java RMI, binds the server object to the registry, and the users get the callback that the server is online. So back to our user stories, we're going to kind of go with the two user example and create a buyer user and a seller user. So I'm going to do that real quick. Create Joe Buyer and log in. We see that we've created Joe Buyer, the server's created Joe Buyer, and we get a notification observer registration for Joe Buyer so that the server has something to call back to on the client remotely if it needed to. So we'll also create our Mike seller user, and we get the same notifications prompted from the server that user's been registered. So if we go back to Joe Buyer here and we click on the Browse tab, we'll see there's really no listings yet, so really nothing to buy. Joe Buyer is bored, so he's going to leave and possibly come back later. And we'll head on over to the Sell tab for Mike Seller, and let's create an auction. So we're going to list, like an iPhone 7, and we're going to give it a rather, short duration. And we'll give it a description. Shiny new iPhone 7. Alright, so we'll go ahead and hit list item. We get a feedback from the client application that's been created. And the server, you can see, has created an item here, listing item for our iPhone 7 that we just created. And this happened when we pressed the button. We called a remote method from the server, which went to our listing factory, generated a listing, return it to the server, server holds on to it and sends that listing back to us with some confirmation. So great, we've successfully listed our first item. I think the buyer is probably interested now, so we can fire up another instance of DragonBids client. I'll stack that back on top. And this time let's go back ahead and log in as our buyer that we created, Joe Buyer. So we should see, welcome back Joe Buyer. And the server identifies that the user has connected to the server. Since he already exists, no need to create him again. Now when we go back to the Browse tab, we see our iPhone 7. Joe Buyer could double click on this iPhone 7 and we see the title and the description that we created, and some other features that we're still in the middle of implementing. But conceivably, Joe Buyer can now come and place a bid and send that bid over to the server for acceptance. I want to contrast a little bit the listing detail tab for the buyer and the seller. So from the seller's window down here, if we go to the browse tab, we see our iPhone 7, but when we double click it and take ourselves to the listing details page, we see a few new buttons that we didn't see from the buyer's perspective. Well, this is because the client is smart enough to know that the buyer, that the user on the client side is the owner of this auction. And we could do some things like modify, for example. Like, we forgot that this was the iPhone 7 Plus. So we want to get as much money as we can. We'll say big shiny new iPhone and modify. So we got a log here on the server side, which identifies that we've modified our listing. And Joe Buyer can come back to browse and see this update as well, propagated onto his window once he double clicks on it. Likewise, from the seller window, we can remove this auction. So clicking remove item would remove this listing on the server. We get the server log here. And attempting to go to browse on either client or server will show that we have no more auctions. We still have a few more features to implement, but we're pretty confident that we can go ahead and create all those hooks and tie in all those features that we identified in the beginning when we wrote our user stories. I hope you enjoyed our demo. Thanks for watching.